I'd like to begin our module on myths about social media by picking up on one of the key points from the previous module on media effects. In that module, we spoke about the dangers of binary thinking in relation to the development of media technologies. Now, we spoke about that binarism in relation to young people and digital technologies, and we'll return to that idea later in this module, but I want to open it up and remind us of the dangers of thinking about the internet and social media, which is the focus of this module, in either good or bad terms. So social media is inherently good, social media is inherently bad. Those two polar opposites really hide the messy truth of the way we use media technologies, which is somewhere in between those two extremes. Now, avoiding that binary thinking is a really difficult thing to do when we're in the middle of seeing media platforms emerge right in front of us, which is what social media is in fact doing. You know, at the moment we're rewriting or writing and constantly rewriting the rules of how we communicate, particularly using social media, and that has all sorts of runoff effects in terms of other forms of communication, such as face-to-face interactions and the use of technologies for interpersonal and public communication. So thinking about social media in that complex way that avoids binarism is difficult, but the two ways in which we can do it again go back to the previous module on media effects, where we stressed the importance of taking prevailing social attitudes about media seriously. So looking at those folk theories, those arguments in relation to social media, that it's destroying the way we communicate, that people don't pay attention to face-to-face interpersonal communication anymore, and that's weakening the strength of our social relationships and our social ties. So we need to take those kinds of folk theories, those everyday attitudes about social media that we might hear in conversations, that we might read in media reports. We need to take those seriously, but also we need to look at evidence relating to the impact of social media on society. And that's what I want to do, and that's what I want us to do over the course of this module, to balance those folk theories, everyday attitudes and ideas relating to how we use social media and its impact on society, balance those against evidence which relates to that impact as well. The aim of this introduction is not really to give you a kind of overall comprehensive history of the development of the internet and social media, because we'd be here forever to do that. But what I want to do is start off with looking at the birth of the internet and the ideologies surrounding the early days of internet culture. And those ideologies were overwhelmingly optimistic in a lot of respects, and they kind of converge around this notion of the Californian ideology. So the Californian ideology was a piece published on the website Mute, and there's a link to the original article in this module. Now, the reason why it was called the Californian ideology was for two reasons. First of all, Silicon Valley, where all of these, or the vast majority at least, of these technological developments and advances were born, is obviously in California. But also, the term the Californian ideology is apt because early internet culture was kind of a combination of cybernetics, the study of how systems work to regulate themselves, free market economics, and counterculture libertarianism. So there was this sort of, in some ways, quite contradictory mishmash of science, laissez-faire economics, the market, the free market would take care of itself, and free speech liberalism in relation to the content that was available on, or could be available on, the internet. So these kind of three ideologies intermingled and gave birth to what was known as the Californian ideology, and we can see that in magazines and publications like Wired, which is still around today, were sort of early champions of this way of looking at the world. And what resulted was a form of technological determinism. So the idea that in the future, social and cultural debates, social and cultural problems will be resolved and will ultimately become meaningless because technology will solve them for us. So technological determinism is this uncritical belief in the ability of technology to solve human problems, so to solve social and cultural problems. Now, 30 years down the track, we know that that is just not the case. But that optimism was very much at the heart of the early ideology surrounding the development of the internet. So we revisit those ideas that we explored earlier in the unit, that digital media was seen as offering us the potential for greater access to information, greater diversity of opinion, the creation of a global public sphere, the idea that digital technology would connect us globally and allow us to participate in global conversations. And of course, we as audiences or users would become empowered through greater opportunities for feedback, the ability not only to talk back to media organizations, but also to create our own content. So those ideas, which should really, really be familiar to you now, kind of underpin the early days of internet culture and what drove the kind of optimism, quite often naive optimism, associated with the rise of technology. Now, we know that as social media, particularly in, say, the last 5 years, has become increasingly mainstreamed, has become increasingly a part of the everyday ways in which we communicate. And also, subsequently, as it's become more commercialized, we begin to see it in a negative light, or a more negative light. And the key concerns in terms of public discussions around the negatives associated with social media have been in relation to the privacy of our data. So how do all the pieces of information that we give social media organizations about ourselves, how do they get used? How do they get sold to other companies? How do they get harvested and used to design messages that appeal to our emotions in ways that may or may not be accurate. So those two key concerns, the privacy of our data and the accuracy of information that we get via the internet and social media, have really been a driving force in terms of public discussions around the benefits and the costs of social media in recent years. And of course, they kind of find their manifestation, if you like, in the Cambridge Analytica scandal.